Rightio. Can you see that?
Yes.
Goodo. So welcome. And today will probably be a fairly short presentation because it's kind of the flip side of what we spoke about in December. So in December, we spoke about describing vocabulary and semantics in child-directed language, and many of the same issues today, which is vocabulary and semantics in child-directed speech, will be the same. So you'll, if you looked at the recording of the last session, or you were at one of the live shows, then you'll recognize a lot of this stuff as well. Um, what's in a word? Word-like units are the child's initial target for verbal communication. So we have pretty good evidence now to show that children on average will begin producing words at about 12 months. This will be pretty slow going, especially over the first 6 months or so, or the next 6 to 12 months, up until the age of when the sketch starts. Between the ages of 2 and 4, you're going to see some clear change across the span of the sketch corpus. And even at the beginning of the sketch corpus at 2 years, uh, some children may not have many words, and that's going to depend on individual differences. But then throughout the course of the sketch, throughout those 2 years or thereabouts, you're going to see lots and lots of development. So this is a domain where descriptions of development are going to where you will see developmental change. Now, as we all know, if we work on different languages, what counts as a word in those languages is going to differ across different topologies. So, the typology of language means the lexicon has different relationships to other domains of language. So, sort of two contrastive examples is something like a polysynthetic language like Murimpata means there's going to be a tight relationship with morphology, whereas a language like Mandarin with a tone system is going to have a bit more of a relationship with aspects of speech like phonology. Um, Luckily, children's initial productions for us are going to be fairly simple, although this makes it difficult for things like transcription, as we all know. And there's going to be, of course, as I said before, some predicted development across time. So here's the core and extension aspects that we recommend in the Sketch acquisition manual to describe when we're looking at vocabulary and semantics. So the core is what's the distribution of word classes and semantic fields across development, which I'll come to next. What's the relative distribution of nouns to verbs across development, uh, which speaks to a kind of perennial issue or a big issue in the field, theoretical issue about whether or not children have a noun bias in acquisition, and we'll come to that also later on in the presentation. When do children begin to use other word classes? This is also a case where, particularly, the language that you're looking at might throw up some language specific flavors where you might go off script, I suppose, and look at other word classes. And do you observe any patterns in the truncation of words, which we'll come to in a moment? Um, One extension that we recommend is that what additional observations can be made about children's semantic development given the language and given the restricted data that you will inevitably have. So let's first talk about word classes and semantic fields. So children's vocabulary won't be so extensive during the recording sessions, so they're not going to say everything that they know, and this is just a fact of recording children. But what we recommend is that the vocabulary that they do use should be coded for the syntactic class and semantic field. And this gives us some general developmental information. So, talking about first semantic fields, so what we recommend is that people take you begin with the MacArthur Bates CDI. So many of you, if not all of you, will know what the CEI is. So it's a parental checklist that breaks up various words in particular languages, and there are lots of languages here. And if you want to have a look across different CDIs and the words that are contained in them, you can look at WordBank, the Stanford site, which has all or lots and lots of MacArthur Bates CDI data on it. from a range of languages and some really nice tools for you to be able to analyze those, given the data set in the repository. So the CDI breaks up the vocabulary items according to semantic fields, and so you can use these as a starting to start. So this is what Hannah Lee and Shanley Allen did in the Inuktitut sketch. So they started out with the CDI semantic fields. They saw which ones were relevant, and they categorized the children's productions according to these. So you see quite a few examples here. Some of the semantic fields being animals, vehicles, food and drink, clothing, baby words, people, kin terms, and locations. Um, there may be important culturally specific terms or categories that you might want to include there. So, for instance, in Inuktitut, where kin terms are important, there was a wider range of them, even though kin terms is in the CDI itself. So that's a nice way to start off, I think. And then we can move on to word classes. So, and in particular the noun to verb ratio in children's acquisition or children's productions. So the distribution of syntactic categories in child-directed language and in children's speech has long been of interest to researchers, and often the difference between what children are hearing and what they're producing can be revealing about what kind of constraints there are on learning. And so this has led to people to argue for a particular noun bias in early acquisition. So this is where, despite the fact that there might be, say, even distributions of nouns and verbs in the input, children's early vocabulary will be very noun dominant. So there's robust evidence for this in many languages, languages like Dutch, English, French, Hebrew, Italian, Korean, and Spanish, but less robust evidence in some other languages. So Marissa Casillas has a recent paper in Saltal in first languages, which shows Saltal children don't seem to have, or there's no evidence for a noun bias. This could be due to many features of Saltal. It's verb initial, nouns are often dropped, it's head marking, all those kinds of things. There's also some debate about whether or not there is a noun bias in languages like Mandarin, where there's rampant noun drop as well, showing that children may have just more exposure to verbs than they do to nouns. In Shanley's and Hannah's sketch, they found, even though there is a lot of noun drop in Inuktitut, they did find evidence for a noun bias in children's early vocabularies. So this is how they presented their the types and tokens of verb roots, noun roots, and what they call localizer roots and interactive expressions across the time points of the sketch. So what they see here is, if you just look at verbs and noun roots here, you'll see that in both types and tokens, there are more noun roots that are appearing in Inuktitut children's, speaking children's productions than there are verb roots, right up until 210. And then only at the age of, once children are past the age of 3, are there more verb roots appearing relative to noun roots. So it seems like in a language like Inuktitut, there's evidence here, even in the sketch data, for there to be a noun bias in early development. And this is one kind of nice demonstration of how the minimal data of the sketch is able to tell us something and contribute to broader debates in the literature. There's another example here. This is not a sketch, but it has a similar kind of approach, and it's a really lovely paper by Taverna and Waxman that I wanted to talk about because because they've used minimal data to do the same thing actually, and it appeared in Journal of Child Language 5 years ago now. I think 2020 was only just yesterday, but there you go. We're halfway into the decade. So what they did, which is a language that's spoken in South America, and they recorded 3 children 5 times across a 12-month period. And what they found is that the noun to verb ratio in the children's production favors nouns but becomes more even across the age, across when children are 3 or older. So this is just data from 2 children in this figure here, and what the figure shows is the adult noun to verb ratio across the recording time points, which is the kind of grayish line with the triangle. What you see there is a pretty even noun to verb ratio. And then because it's lower than zero point 0.5, what we're finding is verbs are favored in the input. Um, but the children's production show that nouns are favored in child 2, who's a little bit more advanced than the child 3. In her speech, she has a noun bias right up until she hits almost 3, and then it's pretty even. But she then models or matches the input there. As you can see, her line is approaching the adult input line. Child 3 is a little bit later in approaching the distribution of the input, but gets there. And what they argued is that this is not about age, but it's about MLU development. So once children had an MLU of over 1.5, and you can see there that once it hits 1.5, it does really start to or approach or is consistent, completely consistent with the noun verb ratio in the input. And once children get this MLU of 1.5, they begin adding more verb stems, verb affixes, noun affixes to their vocabulary. What they argue here is this consistent with old arguments from Gleitman about syntactic bootstrapping, so that once you get early nouns, once you've acquired early nouns, this lays the foundation for the acquisition of verbs and other relational terms. Because once you recognize nouns in the input, then you can start to isolate verbs, and in the case of which verbal inflections, to be able to learn a lot more about the other components of the language, other relational components of the language. So next is word truncation. So we see this because of great work by people like Catherine Demuth, that children don't reproduce their input perfectly well, which creates problems with transcription. And they often truncate words, particularly morphologically complex words. So we see this a lot in morphologically complex languages. And maybe Lucy might have something to say about that once I finish this presentation about Murimpata, because I know Bill Forshaw has written about this. So what we see is children are really shortening longer words, but this differs according to languages. So in Inuktitut and other agglutinative languages, children often use isolated morphemes. So we can see here they've isolated a morpheme here, ma, which means kiss, and have used that. So they're kind of segmenting well because of the agglutinative nature of the language, and will only produce these isolated morphemes. But in more fusional languages, and this is data from Kisha May and from Cliff Pye, children don't isolate morphemes, they isolate syllables across morpheme boundaries. So what you can see that here, this is what's happened. The adult model is above and the child that's produced is below. And the child here seems to be actually really doing what Dan Slobin argued many, many years ago, and which is attending to the end of the utterance and is isolating syllables at the end of the utterance, and producing the truncated word on the basis of that. Once again, these are like good examples of how existing phenomena that we know about in the field will appear naturally in the sketch corpus, and can be described often without a lot of need for more quantitative analyses. Once they're there, and once you can map them onto the the uh, the input and the adult model, you can make some inferences about what children are doing here. And the truncation of words raises an important issue in child's productions. As I've mentioned before, they don't always hit the adult target, to put it mildly. And Cliff Pye has suggested in a lovely paper in JCL about child language documentation that a way to analyze this, and we're not saying you should do this, but it might be a good way to organize your data for analyses, is to create lexical concordance sets. And so here's one from his paper from the language Northern Pame. And so what Cliff argues is that you can you can list the child's utterance and list the adult target, and then look at the difference between those. On the basis of these concordant sets, he argues that you could analyze lexicon, segmental inventories, prosody, morphosyntax, and verb arguments, or that will depend on, I guess, the richness of your data. So that's one way to, once your transcriptions are done and you're looking at the lexicon and semantics, you might then choose to do something like this as a way to set up a strategy to analyze your data or to try and develop deeper insights into what's going on in your data. So what kind of extensions could people do? So this will depend on the language. So in Inuktitut sketch, Hannah and Shanley analyzed categories of noun roots. So they went deeper into the category of noun roots because for instance, in Inuktitut, it has a fairly complex and rich set of demonstratives, and they wanted to look at those. And so this, of course, may or may not be something that is relevant to your language. Other components of semantics may be difficult beyond semantic fields from the CDI. So the scope of lexical meanings, like all that beautiful, rich work that Melissa Bauman did with things like her diary studies, might well be beyond the scope of the sketch. Finally, interesting typological features will be revealed through the lexicon. So, for instance, to come back to this Mandarin versus Murimpata contrast, tone will be interesting in a language that uses tone like Mandarin, or morphology will be interacting with the lexicon in a language like Murimpata. Now, this raises the question of where in the sketch you put those interfacing features. Luckily, the sketch is fairly flexible, so I think we're not going to demand that you only talk about, for instance, tone in the sort of speech phonology section, and then you could easily also talk about that in the lexicon and semantics also, where it makes sense to do so. Some further readings. These are the two papers that I've spoken about here in this presentation. So Cliff Pye is documenting the acquisition of Indigenous languages. This is a wonderful paper to think about the lexicon, but also just for various insights into working with understudied languages. And the Witchy paper by Taverner and Waxman, Early Lexical Acquisition in Witchy, in the Witchy language, is also a great reference for your sketch. Okay, so I'll stop sharing now, and then we can take questions or open it up for discussion.
Thanks, Evan. Any questions?
I can ramble about word truncation and Murimpata while everyone thinks of questions, maybe.
Sounds good.
We found that there isn't much truncation, actually. So, yes, verbs especially can be very long in Murimpata and very complex. Sorry, a thunderstorm is starting, in case you hear rumbling. So when some of these long verbs are prompted, the children are prompted to say them, what they respond is truncated because they're not quite there yet. They can't produce it as the target form. But when they're the spontaneously produced, the spontaneous productions from the children in general aren't truncated. It seems they tend to choose shorter forms. They might choose a simple verb rather than a complex one. Or and as Bill found, and as we found at where we are in the sketch acquisition, the acquisition sketch so far. Children seem to use a subset of classifier stems, so parts of the verbs, until a certain age, and then they use a broader set. So there is sort of truncation, but not really. Like the forms they produce tend to be quite target-like, which is interesting.
So do you think that's about conservatism in their productions?
quite possibly.
Yeah, because it's a huge space that they've got to master in wooden puzzles.
Yeah,
Yeah, with the large amount of classifier stems.
absolutely.
So yeah, it sounds like they're being a little bit more conservative in how
Yeah.
they're producing stuff. It might be interesting to see as the kids get older whether or not once they're testing themselves, or or once they're testing the limits of their knowledge, whether or not those come in.
Yeah. And also there are so many things that you can incorporate into the verbal complex, but you don't have to. And so at these earlier stages, of course they're not. And
Yeah.
it is still target-like because you they don't have to be incorporated. Excuse me. But also with language change, and the use of the verb make and do it's just used so much more often these days in sort of phrasal verb constructions that John Mansell talked about in relation to the young men. So yeah, I wonder if the height of complexities in what input the verbs I wonder how long that will last for as well, because there are many ways to say things, and of course, as communicators, we're going to go for the most efficient way.
Yeah, for sure. And yeah, that's super interesting. Well, I guess I'll watch this space then,
Mm.
collect more corpus. Um, Alan, we can't hear you, Alan, for some reason. Your mic seems to be on, but or you're not muted. Hmm. No. Is your volume up? Hmm.
Hello, how's this?
Yeah, we got you. Great.
Good, I had the wrong mic selected. Yeah, thanks for that very concise and informative presentation. You mentioned Slobin making a generalization that kids tend to truncate from the end of the word. Is this what he was saying, that they tend to uh, to produce the final syllables in a multisyllabic word and not the previous ones? Is that
Uh, So one of those sort of operating principles from 85 was pay attention to the end of words. But it seems like, at least in the in Kishinean, that seemed to be in those examples what may have been happening. But with the Inuktitut example, it was actually the that the children were producing. So I
yeah.
think it may well depend on sort of the transparency of the morphemes in the language.
Yes. Yeah. Well, that's what I was thinking. There are competing factors here. In English, I'm now the proud father of a 16-month-old granddaughter who's I spend a lot of time with, and she displays a pattern which I think she knows that she can produce about 200 words now, but um, I think she follows a pattern which I think is fairly common in English. That is, uh, she drops unstressed syllables. It's the primary stress is the main thing. And this is especially, though, for monomorphemic words, right? But in my Kuwaru experience, kids go for a more, um, you might say, morphosyntactically informed truncation, where they, in in expressions that are actually multi-word expressions, but have an imperative verb that goes with them, they latch onto the imperative verb and use that, even if it's not wherever it's placed. I don't know. In Moinsbata, for example, is stress a very strong factor, or is morphological kind of comprehension of the verb and focusing on the most basic parts of it? Is that
I would just impressionistically, I would say stress, but I do want to investigate that properly. So
Yeah.
yeah, impressionistically stress, but possibly not.
But Evan, or any of the rest of you, do you know of studies on this that sort of explore the potential tension between morphosyntactic factors and words and stress in languages that have a stress system? Of course, not all of them do.
Good question. And I'd be groping around in the dark corners of my memory to be
Yeah.
able to come up with this. But as I said before, like Catherine Demuth has done a lot of great work on this, and even has and actually disappeared in on sort of phonological words, as she calls them, and has a is it I think it's Catherine who has kind of like a developmental progression that takes into account all of the various features. I don't know whether she talks about the tension between, say, prosodic versus morphological.
Yeah, she does in some of her work.
Yeah, yeah. So I would recommend checking out Catherine's work, who's really done a lot of really great work on this.
Yeah.
And I may be wrong, but within the kind of like optimality theory kind of framework, is that right, Rebecca? Or
Gosh, now I can't remember.
no.
I would hesitate to say.
It's certainly something Bill spoke about in his monograph that came out of his PhD thesis on Morning Punter, Bill Forshaw.
And we found similar tensions in Pindara, and it was really helpful to turn to Catherine Demuth's work there. But Wanyama did that in more detail more recently than me, so that's why my memory's a bit fuzzy on that. But yeah, we also find that there's truncation, and it could be, oh, maybe they're dropping this morpheme, but maybe it's more stress related. And how do you tease that apart between targeting the verb root versus targeting the stress syllable?
So, Rebecca, what was the database for her study? Was it mostly English or broadly comparative, Lesotho, or what?
Yeah, so for Catherine Demuth's work, it was broadly comparative. There's a lot on Sesotho, and she also references a few other languages.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, and just on your granddaughter, it's not surprising in English that because children very early start picking up on stress syllables to even start segmenting their input. So in a stress time language like English,
Yeah.
you know that this is a really great cue for them to start finding words in the input. And
Correspondingly, there's not very complex morphology. Many multisyllabic words are monomorphemic, so you can afford to drop anyone you want based on stress.
did anyone have anything else? Yeah, Shiba.
I was wondering, sounds to me like these languages that we've been talking about all have like prosodic, regarding their prosody, they all have word level stress. Is there any research done on languages that have like phrase level prominence or other kind of prosodic structures? Because it sounded like the same problems I've been having when I was marking like the intonation units and this and that, like which one is the more prominent one. Sounds a bit like the kids are just like recognizing the most prominent bit, then taking it out, then leaving others behind. So I was wondering how close it's related to the prosodic analysis.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's probably a very good point, right? Anything that marks something as prominent is going to be important, or at least capture the attention of the child in acquisition. So, from the top of my head, my knowledge of the early acquisition is not great. So from the top of my head, I couldn't tell you if people had done exactly stuff like that. But yeah, I would imagine that anything that captures the attention of a child is going to have some kind of input output, well, sort of like perceptual production relationship, so to speak, in early acquisition. I don't know if Rebecca or Lucy have anything to add to that.
No, just that I think that that's yeah, it's always been part of the argument for the edges of words as well. So it's like it's edges of words um and anything that has prominence of some sort, whether that can be in various ways, but it's things which are perceptually easier to grab hold of or to notice.
So I wonder how that would apply to tone languages. Are there particular kinds of tone that are more prominent or easier to grab onto?
Good question. What I know about acquisition of tone is that children do it pretty quickly in tonal languages. So, but I don't know whether or not within a tonal system where certain tones are easier than others, and I don't know of research on that. So,
Mm.
feel very useless today in answering questions.
I imagine so. Just feel the wrong person in this group to be saying this, but from my small experience working with the tonal language, I feel like it would depend on the system in the language, and there might be so in Avatime there's one tone which is quite perceptually salient. It's more rarely used. It's used in very particular circumstances, and it's really quite distinguished from the others. And so I can imagine that in some systems you would get a tone which is more perceptually salient than others, but that would be system dependent.
Yeah.
And these things always, I guess, raise questions about how available is it, like, and how in the input in terms of how frequently it's used and how is it linked to other more functional aspects of what children are learning. Given, I guess, like I said at the beginning, is like the target is for children to sort of communicate, and so that means that words and basic concepts are super important. So maybe the just tone system falls out of those kinds of processes where children are learning common names for things and all that kind of stuff. And by virtue of that, things like highly frequent ones, although I don't know what distributions of tones look like. So I, that's a really interesting question. I've never even considered that. Are there some that are, what kind of distribution does, say, the four tones of Mandarin or the six tones of Cantonese follow? But, and whether or not there is some kind of effect of that on acquisition. I guess as you get more and more tones, a bigger system, then maybe there will be a greater difference in distribution between individual tones. Okay. Any more questions? Shubo, yeah.
This one might be a bit far-fetched, but I was wondering whether there is anything on multilingual settings, because in Vanuatu there is really no lingual settings. And I was wondering if there is any like methodology or just anything a bit closer to that kind of scenario.
Do you mean like within the kind of the sketch framework?
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's something we've conveniently ignored, I suppose. Maybe that's unfair at the moment, largely because a lot of smaller languages or understudied languages will, if they're minority languages, for want of a better term, will be learnt in a multilingual environment. That's for sure, right? And so, one thing we've said, at least in the sketch, is that if you're pick a focus language and look at that language, but do note that within environments there may well be other languages going on, and the our region is a good example of that, right? Places like Vanuatu, places like PNG, also, and it is indeed like Indigenous Australia too, and so we haven't gone down the track of making recommendations to look at children who are multilingual, if that makes sense. So, like growing up bilingual, how could you sketch that? But what we've said is that it might be, I guess, in some multilingual situations, say in Rebecca's case, where kids are learning Pitjantjatjara, and maybe there's like English as a language that's also used in the community, but in school and all that kind of stuff. Maybe we don't care about that because children are learning English anyway, or at least we know about the acquisition of English, not particularly in these settings, but the focus is more on understanding the language that we don't have a lot of knowledge about, which is Pitjantjatjara. So I guess it doesn't mean people couldn't write a sketch on multilingual acquisition, because there's great work that's been done on multilingual acquisition over the years, including using corpus data. But what that would look like, I guess we haven't really thought about it. We parked it really early in the process of developing the sketch, and we haven't got back to it.
Yeah. Just a couple of things to add to that, which is so in bit of work I've been doing with Carmel O'Shannessy, we've been developing, well, largely Carmel. I just tacked on the end for Pitjantjatjara. She's been developing this kind of multilingual MacArthur Bates CDI for Central Australia. And part of that is that there's a large cultural overlap in these languages. And so the CDI is quite similar. But a big thing is that a lot of the families in this region are highly multilingual across these languages. And so it really didn't make sense to try and get them to fill out a survey for one language. And so what we do there is, you look at a semantic entry, like a picture or an English word, and say, does the child have, or actually we have the word in all 7 or so languages that we're looking at here, and does the child use this word or a word in another language? So it's counted as the child has this word, regardless of which language they're using this word in.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you're working with a community which is highly multilingual and kids that are quite multilingual, at this kind of early vocabulary, or at looking at vocabulary acquisition, I'd suggest just marking all the words that the kids are using, regardless, and noting which language it's from, but it counts as they're using this word if it's in language A or language B. The other person I'd suggest looking into is Susie Stiles. So she's been working in Singapore and doing a lot on looking at child language development there, and struggling with the complexity of the multilingualism there. And so she's been talking a lot about methods in that situation that could be interesting.
Thanks, it's really great. Get up.
And if you want to have a look at the Carmel O'Shannessy MacArthur Bates CDI that's kind of multilingual, it's called Um,
That little
little kids.
language app or something like that.
Yeah. Little kid. I should have thought of what it was called before. I thought I knew it.
Hang on, let me have a look.
Little kids learning words or something.
Uh, the project's Little Kids Learning Languages. So if you've got Little Kids Learning Languages.net, Little Kids Word List.
Yeah, the little kids word list.
Yeah, I'll pop the website web address in the chat there. Can put it on the description of the YouTube video as well. Okay, does anyone have any sort of final questions, comments? If not, thanks for coming. And we know it's particularly in this part of the world, it's not everyone's working at this time of the month in January. So yeah, thanks for attending, and we'll see you next month for what I think will be more for syntax actually, and probably more for syntax in the input.